Okay, welcome everybody. I'm glad that you guys all came back from last week, so that's always encouraging to see. Tonight we're going to be covering Obadiah, and hopefully you're able to get through it this past week. What I would like to do, kind of like what we did at the beginning of last class, is take about 5 minutes and the people around you talk about what you saw in your week reading Obadiah. So a key theme, a word, something you didn't understand. Introduce yourself if you don't know the people around you, and then talk about your week in Obadiah. And if you didn't read Obadiah at all, then ask somebody in that group around you to explain Obadiah to you, because it's only it's not that long, right? So it's pretty simple. So all right, you got 5 minutes. Okay. I'm glad that you guys enjoyed reading Obadiah. Sounds like there's a lot of Obadiah discussions going on, so that's good. Let's just quickly recap or talk about what we're going to be doing tonight. So last week we talked about the introduction to the minor prophets. So what we're going to be seeing, how to study them, some big questions, some themes. This week we're diving into the minor prophets. One of the ways that we wanted to do that in this class was not just read them, not just study them on Wednesday nights, but also memorize some of the minor prophets. So we have verse cards here, and can I ask Ed and Kevin to help facilitate those down the table there? So it's Amos 6:8, so it's not in Obadiah. Though if you want to memorize verses from Obadiah, feel free. But it's Amos 6:8, and over the next 3 weeks, we'll try to memorize this one as a class. If you have an accountability partner, this would be a good thing to practice with them. Micah or Amos? Sorry, what did I write on the card? Micah. Yeah. Micah 6:8. Yeah. I don't know what... Yeah, I don't know. Maybe also memorize Amos 6:8? It might be kind of weird.
I abhor the pride of Jacob and hate his stronghold.
Okay.
The city and all that is in it.
Well, that's very representative of the minor prophets, though, isn't it? Okay, so this verse, we're just going to do this for about 3 weeks, and then we're going to get another verse. So, hopefully that's an okay pace. I mean, one verse every 3 weeks, it should be manageable. At that time at the beginning of class next week, it'd be great if some of you already knew it, and we could call on you and ask you to say the verse for us. Tonight, we're going to be going through Obadiah. We're going to be trying to apply Obadiah at the end as well, so we'll try to make sure we have time for that. Next week, we're going to be reading Joel. We're going to be reading Joel, which is a little bit longer than Obadiah, but it's still pretty short. But let's go ahead, and James Locke is going to read the whole... So we get the privilege of studying a book of the Bible that's short enough that we can read the whole book in one setting. We're not going to be able to do that for any of the other minor prophets, but we will tonight. So James Locke is going to read Obadiah for us, and then we'll pray, and we'll get started.
Obadiah, from the beginning to the end. Thus says the Lord God concerning Edom. We have heard a report from the Lord, and a messenger has been sent among the nations. Rise up, let us rise up against her for battle. Behold, I will make you small among the nations. You shall be utterly despised. The pride of your heart has deceived you, you who live in the cleft of the rock, in your lofty dwelling, who say in your heart, who will bring me down to the ground? Though you soar aloft like the eagles, though your nest is set among the stars, from there I will bring you down, declares the Lord. If thieves came to you, if plunderers came by night, how you have been destroyed, would they not steal only enough for themselves? If grape gatherers came to you, would they not leave gleanings? How Esau has been pillaged, his treasures sought out. All your allies have driven you to your border. Those at peace with you have deceived you. They have prevailed against you. Those who eat your bread have set a trap beneath you. You have no understanding. Will I not on that day, declares the Lord, destroy the wise men out of Edom and understanding out of Mount Esau? And your mighty men shall be dismayed, O Teman, so that every man from Mount Esau will be cut off by slaughter. Because of the violence done to your brother Jacob, shame shall cover you, and you shall be cut off forever. On that day, on the day that you stood aloof, on the day that strangers carried off his wealth, and foreigners entered his gates, and cast lots for Jerusalem, you were like one of them. But do not gloat over the day of your brother, in the day of his misfortune. Do not rejoice over the people of Judah, in the day of their ruin. Do not boast in the day of distress. Do not enter the gate of my people in the day of their calamity. Do not gloat over his disaster in the day of his calamity. Do not loot his wealth in the day of his calamity. Do not stand at the crossroads to cut off his fugitives. Do not hand over his survivors in the day of distress. For the day of the Lord is near upon all the nations. As you have done, it shall be done to you. Your deeds shall return on your own head. For as you have drunk on my holy mountain, so all the nations shall drink continually. They shall drink and swallow, and shall be as though they had never been. But in Mount Zion there shall be those who escape, and it shall be holy. And the house of Jacob shall possess their own possessions. The house of Jacob shall be a fire, and the house of Joseph a flame, and the house of Esau stubble. They shall burn them and consume them, and there shall be no survivor for the house of Esau, for the Lord has spoken. Those of the Negeb shall possess Mount Esau, and those of the Shephelah shall possess the land of the Philistines. They shall possess the land of Ephraim and the land of Samaria, and Benjamin shall possess Gilead. The exiles of this host of the people of Israel shall possess the land of the Canaanites as far as Zarephath, and the exiles of Jerusalem who are in Sepharad shall possess the cities of the Negeb. Saviors shall go up to Mount Zion to rule Mount Esau, and the kingdom shall be the Lord's.
Let us pray. Father, we thank you for giving us your word and for the ability to gather and to study it together, to hear it read. I pray for tonight that you would give us clarity, that you would give my speech clarity, that you would use your Spirit to help us understand your word, that you would give us a focus and a joy in studying your word. And I pray that you would give us an understanding of your word. I pray for those who aren't able to make it here tonight, be it sickness or other reasons, Lord. I pray that you would be with them and that they would not feel left out. I pray that we would be diligent even in our study tonight and carrying this into the next few weeks as we continue to study these minor prophets. In your name I pray. Amen. All right, so the basic format that we're going to try to do for this class is going to be seen in your handout this week. What we're going to do, starting at the beginning of each book, is we're going to go over who the author of the book is, who the audience of the book is, and what the date of the book is. And this is meeting some of those expectations and goals that we have in how we study Scripture and understanding the context and the background. And it helps us to set that before we even begin to talk about the book tonight. So, Obadiah, the book of Obadiah, was written by the prophet Obadiah. which in Hebrew means the servant of the Lord. And there's 13 other Obadiahs in the Bible, and none of them are this Obadiah, which is kind of fun to go and trace all those Obadiahs. But there's none other than this Obadiah, the prophet in the Minor Prophets, who's our author for this book tonight. And unlike some of the other prophets, some of the minor prophets and major prophets, we really have no other details about his life or his family, or where he's from. And even within the text, we don't get an explicit date. We don't get an explicit reference to a certain king or other prophets. And so as we study the book, I think maybe you would have seen references to Judah sticking out primarily. There's also references to Jacob as Israel, but Judah stands out, and we believe that Obadiah was written in Judah by Obadiah, and he was primarily a prophet there. Now, for the audience of Obadiah, again, what is I'm sure you guys just talked about this in your little discussions. What is the major idea or people or name that pops up in Obadiah just all over the place? Edom. Okay. How many of you guys knew a whole bunch of about Edom before this week? Some of you guys knew about Edom, right? But Edom just kind of comes out of nowhere, and you would think that this is being written to Edom. And you're correct in part. We have examples of the minor prophets being written to specific nations. What's another minor prophet that's really notable for this? Jonah, right? Yeah, Jonah was given a message from the Lord to go take to Nineveh. So we don't have that exact prompting from the Lord to Obadiah to go to Edom and pronounce this message. But nonetheless, we can assume that this message was being presented to the people in Judah, but also it would be going to Edom. And why would it be important for us to know that? What is the benefit of having prophecy written for other nations for Judah to read? Why would that happen? And so one of the things that we need to think about, why would the prophets talk about other nations in the Bible, is because let me back up. The reason why we would talk about this is because there is a danger for Israel to be too impressed by the other peoples around them, and thus rely on them as potential allies. And you might have even seen the word ally in Obadiah. So that's one reason why we would have a message written to another nation in God's Word. Another reason why is that there would be a danger of being too impressed by them and thus afraid of the surrounding nations. And we see that also. Israel's constantly operating in fear of the nations around them. And so this fear then is replaced, like they're not trusting Yahweh, instead they're fearing the nations around them. Another reason why we would have a prophet write a message, and why God would send a message about another nation, is that there's a danger of thinking that Yahweh will simply write them off and that they'll never have a chance to turn to Yahweh. That God's not interested with the other nations of the world. And so one of the reasons why we want to clarify who our audience is then is it helps us get at the answer to some of those questions that we were talking about. Like why would we want to see this? Why would Israel or Judah want to know? And so as we see Edom, we need to see that there is this connection. There's this connection between relationships with Edom and Esau, Israel and Esau, that we'll get to in a little bit. There's these connections between fear of the nations around them and how to respond, and knowing what God's plan is for the nations around them as well. Now the date. How many of you this week read some other resource about Obadiah, like study Bible notes or a commentary or listen to a sermon? Okay, I'm sure in those notes or resources, you heard a date thrown out there. I'm sure there was a placement around maybe Babylon. Maybe it was an early date. We're going to talk about the dating for Obadiah right now, probably a little bit more in depth than we will for some of the other minor prophets, because it's important for how we view all the minor prophets. And so when we talk about dating in terms of the prophets, there's three categories that we have. Okay, there's three categories. And, sorry, these are not your 1, 2s, and 3 and 4s. So, yes, I see that's really confusing right there. There's going to be 4 reasons why we're going to pick the early date, is why I have there. But there's 3 categories, and that's the pre-exilic date, so before Judah is exiled. No, that's fun. So we have the pre-exilic category, so this is before the exile. We have the exilic category, which is written during Judah's exile, and we have the post-exilic category, which is written after the exile. So we have 3 kind of big categories right away to slot our minor prophets in. And Obadiah is a pre-exilic book. A pre-exilic book. It's written before the exile. And this used to be the predominant view of Obadiah, but in the past probably 40 years, that's probably changed a little bit. So probably some of your commentaries and study Bibles might have even been a little bit squirrely in different places on that. And so I'm going to give you 4 reasons why. So I can't talk about all the other reasons why people will justify it in these other places, but I can give you 4 reasons why it is a pre-exilic date. It was written in the 840s BC, and why it is the first book of the Minor Prophets. So the first reason.
Are these the 4?
Yes. Thank you. The first reason number 1. The placement of Obadiah within the canon, so where it's placed with the other minor prophets in the Bible, put it with the other pre-exilic books. The other pre-exilic books in the Bible. Now, that by itself, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's pre-exilic, but it seems like there's a reason why you would expect it to be with this grouping, and why we should look at the Bible and see that there. Number 2, the historical context. And we're going to cover this a bit more as we go through tonight. But let me just give you kind of the summary of the historical context for Obadiah, for this pre-exilic dating. It was during the reign of Jehoram. And during Jehoram's reign, and we're going to get to more details on that. I'll give you the passage. I'm just giving you the overview. During Jehoram's reign, Edom rebelled against Judah's rule. And then Judah and Jerusalem were attacked and ransacked, and the Philistines and the Arabs came in and took over and even took out the royal family and kidnapped them and only left one survivor. And Edom, Israel's brother, did nothing. And in fact, they joined in during that time. So this is Obadiah's recounting then in this book. This is Obadiah's recounting of Edom's actions, and that perfectly fits that timeline. All right, your third reason. Within the book itself, the warning in verses 12 through 14 do not make sense if it's talking about a past event. So the warning in verses 12 and 14 are talking about, hey, do not do this when this thing happens in the future. And we'll get into that. But you can't talk about a warning if you're talking about something that's either happening or happening right then, right? Or it's already happened. Like, you can't say, like, well, I'm going to warn you about this thing that you already did. No, it's like, it's too late. You're getting judged for it. And so that's why at the beginning there's this pronunciation of what you have done, don't do it again. As we'll see as we get into the book itself. All right, lastly, number 4. The other prophets, and really we're talking about Joel and Jeremiah, use Obadiah and his message. And they build on it. That's something we talked about last week, that the minor prophets build on each other. They take pieces of Scripture and explanations of Scripture, and they use them so that you would have a context and an understanding of what God is saying. And Obadiah, then, we will argue, is that Obadiah sets the context for how you would understand the minor prophets. Obadiah sets the context for this idea of judgment. Obadiah sets the context for the day of the Lord and this restoration. Obadiah sets the context of God changing his focus from Israel to the nations. Obadiah sets that context for the rest of the minor prophets, and the rest of the prophets even really in general. And because of that, we would say that even though this book is very short, it's one chapter, it's really important. If you change how you understand where Obadiah is dated, it changes how you have to then interpret other scriptures. And so we're trying to be the most historically accurate, we're trying to be the most faithful to the text, and even faithful to the grammar within the text as we look at that prophecy even there in verses 11 through 14, or 12 through 14. Okay, so those are our 4 reasons why we're going to say it's a post-exilic date around 845 BC. Pre, did I say? Oh, yeah. Ooh, thank you. You guys were on it, though. You knew I was wrong. 845. And if you have a question about that and you want to talk about it afterwards, I read a lot of stuff about it, so I'm ready to talk about that, but not right now. Okay, so let's talk about the historical context then of Obadiah in greater detail. So Obadiah is around and inside the events that happened during King Jehoram's rule of Judah in the 840s BC. And so the relevant chapters in the Bible then for that would be 2 Chronicles 21 and 2 Kings 8. So this is assuming that you guys are wanting to really go back and do more work and go like, okay, I just read Obadiah a whole bunch, but now I want to read it again and read these cross-references. But if you aren't going to do that, at least make these notes so that you can know when you're reading Obadiah later, you go like, these are important chapters that have to do with something in Obadiah. But 2 Chronicles 21, 2 Kings 8, they talk about Jehoram's rule and the events that happened. I'll just read 2 verses from there. 2 Kings 8, 20 through 21. So in his days, talking about King Jehoram, Edom revolted from the rule of Judah and set up a king of their own. And then Jehoram, he's got 2 names kind of in Scripture. It's kind of confusing. He's actually got 3 names, but we won't talk about that. Then Jehoram passed over to Zaire with his chariots and rose by night, and he and his chariot commanders struck the Edomites who had surrounded him, but his army fled home. As in, he tried to get Edom back. Edom revolted against Judah, and he kind of flopped, and it didn't work out. And then in 2 Chronicles, we see that that Jehoram is not pleasing God. He's not doing the right things, and Yahweh is angry with him. And so it says in 2 Chronicles 21, 16 through 17, the Lord stirred up against Jehoram the anger of the Philistines and of the Arabians who were near the Ethiopians. And they came up against Judah and invaded it and carried away all the possessions they found that belonged to the king's house, and also his sons and his wives, so that no son was left to him except Jehoahaz, his youngest son. So this is the context of the beginning part of Obadiah. So you're reading about, like, what have you done? What did you do? Why didn't you help? This is the events that just happened. And from Scripture, from these scriptures, these passages, and even in Obadiah, we can kind of piece together this picture that Edom knew what was happening and didn't help. And maybe they actually helped the bad guys kick Judah while he was down. And so this is one event that's referenced in Obadiah that's important to have in mind. The second important event that's referenced in Obadiah is a future event. And it's talking about the exile in the middle in verses 12 through 14. It's the exile of Judah. So this event is now getting forecasted and talked about, that there's going to be a time when Judah is going to get kicked again, and they're going to get taken out again, and their gates are going to get destroyed again, all that kind of stuff. So those are the 2 historical context events that we need to have in mind as we read Obadiah. So let's go through the big idea, and this is I want you guys afterwards to come and give me feedback on how you think the big idea went. Because what we're trying to do is have what the book is talking about and then a theological idea that like applies to us, right, as we think about it and live life. So the big idea of the book, the main idea of the book, is that God will judge Edom because of their sin against Judah. And even tied into that idea is this promise of restoration for Judah in the future. But the big idea is this judgment upon Edom because of what Edom has done against Judah. But the theological idea, the main theological idea of the book, like why is this book in the Bible? What is the benefit for us today? Is that we need to see that God will rightfully judge the nations of the world because of their sin against him and his people. God will rightfully judge the nations of the world because of their sins against him and his people. And that's true today as true as it was back then with Judah and Jehoram. And as we now step into the book itself, and as we start walking through Obadiah, we need to see this idea that's being forecasted here in this book, that God is expanding his judgment and salvation plan from beyond just Israel to the whole world. And this is our first step. We're going to be seeing this unfold as we go through the minor prophets. We're going to see it unfold even in Joel next week. But it's this idea of the scope being opened up. It's getting broader. But let's go ahead and start walking through the book of Obadiah. And the first thing that we see right at the beginning, I'm sure this is the first thing that you guys all thought as well as you started reading it last week. The vision of Obadiah, thus says the Lord, concerning Edom. Concerning Edom. And you just have to ask, who is Edom? Like what? Like why is this happening? Where is this coming from? Again, why do the prophets talk about these other nations? And so Edom has a rich history. There's a rich backstory in the Bible. And I hope some of you had the time to maybe try to uncover some of that. We're going to walk through it really briefly right now. But it's a really fascinating way that God uses his word and his interactions with his people and his promises in his people earlier in the Bible, and how they work through Scripture to get to this place here in Obadiah and what's happening in Obadiah. And so let's go ahead and look at how the Bible builds up to Edom and where we're at in Obadiah. So Esau and Jacob were the sons of who? Isaac. Right. And so Isaac had Rebekah, and they were pregnant. And the Lord said to Rebekah in Genesis 25:23, 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger. And this is Edom and Israel walking on the scene, so to speak, in the story of Scripture. And so Esau, he's born first, right? He's all hairy, and that's kind of the concept that you have of Esau right away. Is he's this hairy, angry dude, and he's the fighter, the bruiser. And he comes out, and Jacob's right there after him. And as we even see in the story of Jacob and Esau, they have this tenuous relationship. Like they're not great friends. Jacob tricks Esau out of his birthright, out of his inheritance. Esau is not doing what God wants him to do. He's not even doing what his parents want him to do. There's the blessings of Jacob and Esau, and the blessing there in Genesis 27:39 through 40 is really apt for how we want to think about what's happening in Obadiah. It says, Isaac's blessing him. It says, "Behold, away from the fatness of the earth shall your dwelling be, and away from the dew of heaven on high. By your sword you shall live, and you shall serve your brother. But when you grow restless, you shall break his yoke from your neck. So this is the relationship between Jacob and Esau being forecasted. And so God gives to Esau the hill country of Seir, which is... I'll be honest with you guys. I was going to draw a map beforehand so that you didn't have to watch me draw a map live. But we're going to draw a map right now. All right, what's that? No. All right, so we have the Dead Sea over here. We have the Sea of Galilee up here. We have the River Jordan here. We have the coastline. We have Jerusalem over here. And over here, in this mountainous, not so great place to live, and most of you guys can't even see it because it's too low, so, is Edom. All right? Edom's over here to the south. The Negev, which we actually saw referenced in Obadiah, is off over here. It's this mountainous, dangerous desert. It's not like smooth sand dunes. It's not a great place to go live. This place over here is not a great place to go live either. It's mountainous. You saw even in the blessing to Isaac is that there's nothing there really for you to live off of. It's not going to be a great place to live. But that's Edom, and that's the land. There's actually a mountain there called Mount Seir, which, funny enough, has to do with being hairy. And this is Esau's home, and this is where his peoples start to build a land for themselves. The blessings to Abraham still get applied to Esau in this roundabout way, in the sense that he's going to be a father. There's going to be a lot of people coming out from him. He's going to be a father of many peoples as well, just like we saw with Ishmael. And this idea that these nations are coming out from Abraham, from Isaac and Jacob, is happening with Esau. And so Esau, he's living down there. In Deuteronomy 2:6, we actually see that, Deuteronomy 2:6, we see that God says that he gave Mount Seir to Esau, as in God planned this. This is God's plan. This is part of where God has sent him to live. And in the interactions between the Israelites coming out of Egypt and coming into the promised land, to the land of Canaan, they're told to not mess with Esau and his land. That's Esau's land. I gave it to him. Don't go over there. You're not going to take anything from him either. You're going to buy it. I don't know how many of you saw that either in Deuteronomy 2 or in Numbers 20. And actually, in Numbers 20, we get this idea of how the peoples of Israel and the peoples of Edom interacted. In Numbers 20, we see that Israel is going by Edom, and they want to cut through their land. And they're like, "Can we cut through your land, please?" And Edom's like, "No, you can't. And in fact, we're going to park our army right by over here, so you really can't." And so this tenuous, head-butting relationship is just found all throughout Scripture. As we get to the time of the kings, Saul fights them. David conquers them. He's ruling over them as king. Solomon's ruling over them as king. But they're a thorn in the side of Israel. Which brings us to the context of Jehoram, king of Judah, and this time of Obadiah. And so Edom revolts in 2 Chronicles 21. They take over Judah's rule. They actually even kick out the king, or kick out the king when he comes back to try to take back the lands. And as he does this, they curse God's people. They curse Israel. We're going to pick up on that theme at the end. But they reject God's people. They curse God's people. As we know in Genesis 12, God says, "I'll bless those who bless you, and I'll curse those who curse you." And so this leads us to Obadiah and Edom's sin. So Edom's sin. The judgment on Edom's sin there on page 4 for you guys. So it starts with this proclamation of Yahweh. "Thus says the Lord," and this is what Obadiah is seeing is happening, saying, "Thus says the Lord concerning Edom And this is Obadiah seeing that there's a report going out from the Lord to these other nations who are going to judge Edom for what Edom has done. And the way it's even worded there in Obadiah is like, this is already happening. Like, Obadiah is watching this happen as it's unfolding. And the nations are being sent to judge. And God makes a promise right there in verse 2. Behold, I will make you small among the nations. You are greatly despised. Jacob I loved, Esau I hated. Like it's right there even as we are in Obadiah. And this proclamation from Yahweh is about the sin of Edom against Israel, against Judah in particular. And what is this sin? What do we see right there in verse 3? What is the first sin that's listed? Pride. Yeah, pride or arrogance. It's pride against God. This is Edomites saying that you're not going to be our God. You can't stop us. We get to do what we want. And you who live in the clefts of the rock, up in this mountain over here, you're saying in your place, in your heart, in your dwelling place up in the mountains, who's going to bring me down? Who can stop me? We've stopped everybody from taking us back. We've stopped Israel or Judah from coming and reclaiming us. We're our own people. We can do whatever we want. And so God declares that he will bring them down, that there will be destruction. And so verses 5 through 9 talk about how utter this destruction will be upon Edom. And it's a destruction to the point where robbers and thieves won't even have anything worth stealing from. Like you're not going to even have anything worth going through and trying to take. There's nothing going to be left over when you gather up your grapes in your vineyards. Everything's going to be destroyed. All your treasures are going to be taken. Your allies are going to leave you. Now, again, we have to go over this nature of covenant and relationship. Even though there wasn't an official covenant between Edom and Judah in any sense, as family, as brothers, as relatives, there was an obligation to provide for one another or to care for one another, or at least be considerate towards one another. It definitely means that you're not supposed to break your word. You're not supposed to go against them in a deceptive way. But that's what Edom had done to Israel and to Judah. And so, what is the result? How will they be judged for that? Verse 7, all the men allied with you will send you forth to the border, and the men at peace with you will deceive you and overpower you. You're going to get your own medicine served right back to you. You're going to get what you did to them. That's going to happen to you, and that's going to be your downfall. That's how you're going to be judged. And it's going to be such a complete judgment that their teachers and leaders and generals will be wiped out. And you see that in verse 8. Your wise men, those that have understanding, your mighty men, they're all going to be wiped out. There's going to be no Edom left that's going to be worth of anything. And when will this happen? This is our first big minor prophet thing that we got to see as we go forward through the minor prophets. When will this happen? Verse 8, on that day. So what day is it? It's the day of judgment. And often in the minor prophets, we're going to see that this on that day phrasing is going to be tied to the day of the Lord. And actually, as we go further in the minor prophets, when we see on that day, we're going to be expecting like, oh, this is talking about the day of the Lord type stuff. Like we should be seeing this somewhere soon in the text. And even here in Obadiah, you see on that day that reference to judgment, and you just go down to verse 15, and there you have, for the day of the Lord, on that day of judgment. And so, again, this is where we have to talk about how we think about prophecy, how we think about this promise of judgment in the near, physical, literal thing over here, and this far off, eschatological, but also literal judgment. And so, I was encouraged to draw another illustration of how this works. So I'm going to draw two mountains. I did the mountain explanation last week, but I'm just going to ask somebody this. All right, so here's a mountain, and here's a mountain. Stacy, how far away are those mountains from each other?
Can't tell.
Oh, okay. Well, they might look like they're this close,
Yeah,
right?
they look very
But
close.
actually, if I were to draw them on the side, there'd be a mountain over here and a mountain over here. So Stacy, they're that far apart. You're welcome. Yeah, it's 2.5 feet. So it's not that small, right? But if we were to look at a mountain right over there and we were to see another mountain behind it, we don't have that distance. We don't know how far that judgment is going to be. Or, sorry, the mountain peaks are going to be. But if we go to the side, we can see, like, oh, there's many miles between these mountain peaks. Well, here we have the same idea of judgment being floated, this day of judgment, on that day, the day of the Lord, being brought up. And we don't know. Obadiah is not telling us how far away these days of judgment are. Just that there's these days of judgment that are coming. And so one is this physical, literal, near day of judgment that's coming for Edom. But it's going to give us this idea of what the day of judgment for all time is going to look like. And so we see in verse 8, then, on that day will I not destroy the wise men from Edom and your understanding from the mountains of Esau. And then how desolate and devastating is this going to be? So that everyone may be cut off from the mountain of Esau by slaughter. And so then verses 10 through 11, we get the charges. The charges, the reasons why. This is the lawsuit being brought forward to the person who's broken this covenant between brothers. And here's the charges that God puts before Edom. And he says, because of violence to your brother, you will be covered with shame because of your violence. On that day, you stood aloof. And so this is where we have to again talk about the historical context, what's going on. And Obadiah is saying, on the day that those Philistines and the Arabians, the people from the south came and conquered Jerusalem right there, you didn't help your brother. You just stood there. You're like, oh, well, I guess that's what's happening right now. But you were aloof. You didn't do anything. And even there at the end of verse 11, it says, and depending on the translation, you too were as one of them, as in like you joined in, actually, in what was happening to your brother. And because of that, you're going to be cut off and you're going to be covered with shame. So, you have to note that these are talking about what has happened, right? Like that pronunciation of judgment there in verses 10 and 11 is talking about what has already happened. Those things that happened to Judah already happened and you didn't help, and therefore you're getting judged. Because the text changes here in verses 12 through 14. And this is a warning against future sins here in verses 12 through 14. And we have these explicit prohibitions of what not to do in the future. And just notice this repetition, right? You have, do not do this, do not, do not, do not. And the repetition of, in the day of their destruction or distress or calamity. And so what is this talking about? What is this talking about? Well, it's talking about the judgment on the day of judgment, the day of the Lord, that Judah is going to be facing. And it sounds interesting, right? That Edom would be commanded on how to behave when Judah gets taken out, when Judah gets judged by God for their sin. God's saying, look, Edom, I'm going to judge you for your sin, but know this, that I will judge Judah also for their sin. And this is what it's going to look like. They're going to be, it's going to be a day of misfortune. And don't rejoice over it. Don't boast in their destruction and their distress. Don't go into their city when it's empty and take away whatever you want. Do not loot their wealth. Do not stand and help the captors find the fugitives that are being hunted down and hand them over. Don't go and help those who are judging my people Judah. And so this warning then is for the future. And so as we then understand how and even where this is happening in the history of Israel, this is talking about the exile. And we know that Edom, like the remnants of Edom that are left from the different destruction of the nations over the next 300 years or so from this time of Obadiah. We know that Edom actually did help in the destruction of Jerusalem again. They disobeyed God's word, right? They did go in and rob the temple. They did go in and destroy Jerusalem with the Babylonians. And so we know then that they did not listen to God's command. They did not listen to what God told them to do. Okay, so this is where we transition. This is talking about how the idea of judgment and salvation is expanding in the minor prophets. And it starts here in verse 15. It starts here in verse 15. Verse 15 says, "For the day of the Lord draws near on all the nations. As you have done, it will be done to you. Your dealings will return on your own head." So this is God taking what he's doing with the Edomites and making an example of it and saying, look, what I'm doing here, how I'm judging Edom for their sin, I'm going to do that for the whole world. I'm going to do that for the whole world. And it's taking and expanding this idea of judgment. It's expanding the way God relates with the whole world. All the times up prior to this, it's really truly been, like since the Abrahamic covenant and this relationship with the line of Abraham, it really had been just Abraham and the people of God and who they interacted with, sure, but it was really just around them. And this is God saying, look, this is going out, this is going further. I'm going to be dealing with the nations in judgment, and primarily in Obadiah, but as we see as we go through the minor prophets, and also in salvation. And so this shift in Obadiah is helping us even get that shift going into the minor prophets. And as we see there, it's as you have done, it will be done to you. There's justice from God to the world. You will be judged for your sins. You will be judged for your wrongdoing. You will reap what you sow. Verse 16, it's this comparison again with Edom and what Edom has done and how it works with the whole world. Because just as you drank on my holy mountain, so just as you, Edom, got to go and celebrate and revel in your victory and see the destruction of the Jews at the hands of the Philistines and the Arabians, just as you saw that happen and reveled in it, so too, and this is a wordplay, like a pun really, even in the Hebrew from Obadiah, he's saying, just like you drank that victory in, you're also going to drink and swallow the wrath of God, right? You will drink and swallow and become as it never existed. And it's talking about God's wrath there. Right? You had fun, you had your time in the sun, now you're going to continually drink the cup of God's wrath for all eternity. And it will be as if they had never existed. Every aspect of thing, of culture, of idea, of words spoken, of any kind of identity that's contrary to God, right, is going to be wiped out, and you're just going to be in this pit of wrath. And so this is an example of Scripture using things that have happened in Scripture to explain other things. This is God using Obadiah's words about judgment for Edom and taking that and expanding that to how we understand judgment in the final day. And so it's this literal near judgment and this literal future eschatological judgment. All right, and so let's look then at this idea of judgment for the day of the Lord. And what is God judging? God is judging all evil, all oppression. And this is the idea of Obadiah, that you have oppressed my people and therefore you will be judged for it, just as you have sinned against me. This idea is the same on Judgment Day. Like, we have a knowledge that the persecution that God's people have faced, that the trials that have gone against Israel and all throughout time, and even into the time of tribulation, as we've been seeing on the Sundays, those persecutions, those injustices against God's people will all be dealt out on the final day of judgment. And God will make everything right. And God has a right to judge. This is what Obadiah is also telling us. That God has a right to go to the world and to be the judge. Creation, as we see in Romans 1, declares God's attributes to the world. Edom, the Assyrians, the Ethiopians, everybody should know who God is.
To do that.
My tablet is talking at me, and I don't know how to stop it. Cool. Sorry, this is my second time teaching off an iPad, so I don't know how that works all the time.
Assyrians, and it probably sound like Siri.
Yes, that is probably exactly what happened now. Yeah. So God's right to judge then is based off of creation, off of our own consciences convicting us, and note how God talks to the Edomites. He's saying, you should have known this is wrong. You know this is wrong. Like, this is wrong, and yet you've done it anyways. And so all the nations are guilty. No one across space or time will be free. And again, as we go forward in the Minor Prophets, we'll see that apart from God's mercy, no one can be saved on that day. And here, we don't see any promise of salvation. But actually, as we go through, I think it's going to be in Amos or Micah, we will see that there's even a promise for salvation for the Edomites, in the sense that God is going to be merciful even to those people as well. And it's just a kind of a sign of like God's mercy to those who have hated him and have oppressed his people. That God would even be merciful to them and offer them salvation. Okay, so we have this idea of judgment, but then we have this idea of salvation very clearly for Israel in verses 17 through 21 as we get close to the ending of this chapter here. Unlike Esau, and again we have this comparison between Israel and Esau. Unlike Esau, Israel will be restored on that final day. There's going to be judgment for the nations who have rejected God, but there's going to be salvation for God's people from the judgment. And note how particularly this is tied to the land. This salvation is tied to the land. God has made promises in his word to Abraham in particular about what we talked about last week, right? About the land that I'm going to give you, the peoples that are going to come from you, and that the world will be blessed through your offspring. Right? Those are the kind of the three prongs of that promise. And here we see that God is faithful to his promise. It's faithful to his promises. He's going to restore them to their land. And he's even going to do it in a way where they're going to be the ones enacting the judgment upon Edom. There, verse 18, you see that Jacob and Joseph are these flames, right? They're destructive, purifying fire. And they're going to wipe out Esau. And then there's going to be no survivor of Esau. And then they're going to possess the lands that even Esau had down here. And they're going to be the ones to rule over them. They're going to be in them. And they're going to do what Esau didn't do. They're going to obey God. They're going to be a covenant people of God. They're going to represent God's image to creation there. And so we have this promise of returning to the land. Verse 20, we have that phrase, and the exiles of this host of the sons of Israel. Like this, the ones that have been sent out and spread out all over the world, they will be gathered back and they will be settled in this land. And so it's just God being faithful to his promises that he's made in his word. It ends in verse 21. Some of you might have saviors or judges or deliverers for that verse. The deliverers will ascend Mount Zion and judge the mountain of Esau, and the kingdom will be Yahweh's. The kingdom will be the Lord's. And so it's this ultimate fulfillment of God's plan for creation, even plan for His people to rule the earth in the way that He wants them to be righteous, to be holy, to be just. And they will do that even from Mount Zion to the kingdom and the mountain of Esau. And that last line, the kingdom will be the Lord's. It's this idea of ruling, right? This is an idea that there's going to be a king. That there's going to be someone who will rule this kingdom. We don't see it here in Obadiah, but we're going to be talking about who that king is and where he came from. And so how great is it that we can see God's faithfulness to His promises kind of every step of the way through the Bible. We get to Obadiah, and we see that the nation of Edom had cursed the nation of Israel. God was faithful to His promise and saying, I will curse those who curse you. You're going to be judged. You're going to be punished for what you've done. And by using you as an example, I'm going to show how my judgment is going to go out to the whole world, even, and how I will be just and judge over the whole world. And in doing that, how I will save my people and make my people fulfilling their promises and make my people righteous in their own land so that they can do exactly what I have promised that they will do. So this is what we see in Obadiah. And as we end there in our walk through the book, I have four kind of big ideas of what we see in Obadiah. And hopefully we can build on these. Hopefully you can keep some of these in mind even as we move on from the minor prophets and you go down years down the road. So what do we see in Obadiah? Number one, we see that God judges sin in those who oppress His people. Number one, again, is God judges sin in those who oppress His people. Number two, God uses Edom as an example of His focus going not just to Israel, but to the nations. And that's in terms of judgment and salvation. This is the kicking off point of the minor prophets, of this being expanded out. Three, and I'll repeat that one more time. God uses Edom as an example of His focus going not just to Israel, but to the nations. Three, and this is an important truth to carry through the minor prophets, God will judge the nations on that final day. And by implication, that means that there's a standard for this judgment and for God's justice. So God will judge the nations on that final day. And then number four, God will restore His people. God will restore His people. He will make things right that have been made wrong throughout the history of the world because of sin, because of hardness of heart, because of rejection. He's going to make things right. God will restore His people. He will be faithful to His promises. Okay. So applications. What we're going to do is I'm going to run through quickly these applications. And then what I would like you to do is take 5 minutes to talk to your neighbors again. And by the way, so I know how people are. I know you have your seat and you're never moving from it ever again. Like, this is your seat for the rest of the class and maybe for all eternity. And that's okay. I understand. That's how it works. Like, I went to college. I understand. You can start fights by moving seats. But if you switch your seat, if you go so far to risk, to dare to do that at some point, you might meet somebody else that you don't know very well, who's also a part of this body. So I would encourage you to do that. Somebody else to talk to. Maybe you really, really, really like talking to the person next to you, and that's great. And that means you can be friends and talk outside of class, and then you go find somebody else in the class. But anyways, so I'm going to have you talk to the people around you for 5 minutes, and then we'll close in prayer after that. But let me run through some applications, and I hope that you would have applications that you've thought through and worked through in your time in God's Word this past week, and maybe even thinking through the class right now. But here's some just questions to try to help trigger us to think about God's Word and how we should apply it. So what did we learn about God in Obadiah? Well, we learned that God is just, and I'm going to say a lot, so just catch what you can, and remember if you can't catch what I say. So God is just. God knows what happens to his people. God will judge sin for what it is. And there's no escaping God's justice. And there's all sorts of implications on that, on how we should view our sin, how we should view how God thinks about it, how God wants us to interact with other people. What do we learn about man? Well, we have the example of Edom, and really, I think the chief thing that's brought forward is his pride. His pride. How his pride deceived him as a people, how they were deceived by their prideful hearts. And pride does the same thing for us. It deceives our hearts. It gives us a false sense of security. It makes us think that we can hide our sin. It makes us think that we won't be judged. And just know that God can and he will remove you from your place of pride. And he had no problem judging a whole nation for their pride. So what do we learn about God's plans and promises? God has a plan for judgment for the whole world. God is faithful to keep his promises to Abraham in the promise of a blessing and cursing, to Jacob and in his faithfulness to the nation of Israel, even to Esau. I mean, God said through Isaac, right, this blessing, like this is what's going to happen. This is what your life is going to look like, and we can see that God was right. Like that blessing was true. It's lived out. That there was going to be this time even of breaking off that yoke. And so we see that God has faithfully fulfilled his promises. So what has God promised to us that we can be sure that he's going to faithfully fulfill? How can that give you confidence and encourage you and maybe pick your chin up from just looking at your life and to look at God and his faithfulness? How can I live life in light of these truths this week? So maybe that's practically seeing the results of pride and looking again at the downfall of a nation and just being wary of that in your own heart. Maybe that's being compassionate to the people around you and realizing that they fall under that category of the nations of the world, that all of them will be judged on that final day. So that means that we should be bringing the message of the gospel to those around us, that we should be thinking about that we should just know that the gospel needs to go to them, that they are going to be judged, they're going to be facing that judgment. Maybe even that's reading about God's promises this week. Maybe you're not certain of like what has God promised what are all the God's promises that apply to me right now as a believer today. So maybe it's just even discovering some of that. I personally really like this question. How can I share these truths with others this week? So there's other saints at GBC who aren't here. There's other people in your life, and it's always an encouragement to me when somebody says, "Here, look, this is what I've been reading in God's Word. See how cool God's Word is. See how God fulfills His promises, or this connection in Scripture." So how can you encourage somebody else like that this week? How can you help them get into God's Word? And this question is where I'll leave you guys for your discussion time. Why do others need to hear these truths? Both believers and unbelievers. So why the truths that are in the book of Obadiah, the message of Obadiah, why do others need to hear that? So go ahead, take 5 minutes, and I promise I will stop you so that you feel like you're going to be trapped here for the rest of the night. I will stop and I'll pray, and then we can be dismissed. But yeah, go ahead, take 5 minutes and discuss these applications. Maybe have your own applications, examples, questions. Go. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and pray. But I love it. You're talking about the Bible. But I'm going to go ahead and pray so that Exactly. Thank you, James. Go ahead and pray, but then by all means keep talking after I pray. All right. Okay. Just a reminder, we're reading Joel this coming week. It's 3 chapters, so shouldn't be too bad. We have the memory verse card, but let's go ahead and pray. Dear God, I thank you for this book of the Bible that you have for us, and how important it is, how we can see how your plan for salvation and judgment unfolds through it, how you've been faithful to your people Israel, and what that means, and what you've promised for the future, and how we can think about the promises that are made to us, and how we should expect you to fulfill those promises, and what we have to look forward to, and trusting in the gospel, and knowing that one day that we will be with you for all eternity, that we will dwell in the land with you in the new heavens and new earth, and just how amazing that will be. I pray that you would just give us a diligence to keep studying your word, that you would give us a newfound interest in trying to understand what's being said and taught in these books of the Bible. I thank you for just the time of fellowship and the enjoyment that people seem to be having in even talking about this book of the Bible, Lord. I pray that you would bless this time tonight for us, and that you would have us drive home safely. In your name I pray. Amen.